A chance encounter. A powerful businessman finds a hungry street boy begging for food. Moved by a strange impulse, he offers help, never imagining the consequences. While investigating the boy's origins, he discovers a secret that changes everything. What seemed like a simple gesture transforms into a reckoning with his own past. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Breakfast in Richard Mitchell's duplex penthouse followed the same ritual as always. Seated at the marble table, he flipped through financial reports while his wife, Margaret, kept her eyes fixed on her phone. The silence between them was filled only by the discreet sound of silver cutlery touching imported porcelain. "I have a meeting with Korean investors today. Don't wait up for dinner," he said, without taking his eyes off the documents. Margaret nodded without interest. After 15 years of marriage, the two had become experts at coexisting without really connecting. There were no arguments, no demands, just a tacit agreement of mutual convenience that worked perfectly for both of them. At 9 o'clock sharp, Richard crossed the lobby of the commercial building where his company was located. The security guards greeted him with reverence, while his secretary was already waiting with the day's schedule meticulously organized. At 45, he was respected and feared in the financial market, known for his calculating coldness and the ability to identify opportunities where others only saw risks. During the video conference with the Koreans, Richard conducted the negotiation. With his usual precision, numbers, projections, and guarantees flowed naturally. By the end of the meeting, his company had secured another multi-million-dollar contract. "Congratulations, Mr. Mitchell. You seem to have been born for this," commented one of the directors. Richard merely nodded discreetly. Compliments didn't move him. Results were what mattered. His life was measured by goals and achievements, not by feelings or connections. After the business lunch that extended until 3 in the afternoon, he decided to walk a few blocks before returning to the office. New York's financial district buzzed with life, with hurried executives, street vendors, and scattered tourists. It was a world with which Richard maintained only superficial contact, protected by the invisible shield that his status provided. It was then that, while passing through a tree-lined plaza, something unusual happened. Attracted by an outdoor cafe, Richard decided to sit down to review some documents before returning. The waiter brought a double espresso and a small dessert that accompanied the drink. While organizing his papers, he felt a presence nearby. Raising his eyes, he found himself facing a boy of approximately 12 years old, thin, with simple but clean clothes. What caught his attention most were the boy's eyes, dark, intense, and surprisingly serene for someone so young. "Are you going to eat that?" asked the boy, pointing to the untouched small pastry on the table. Richard's first reaction was annoyance. He was accustomed to having his personal space respected, and rarely was approached by strangers. Normally, he would make a gesture to send the boy away or call the establishment's security. But something in that gaze disarmed him. There was no pleading or drama, just a direct question as between equals. "No, you can have it," he replied. Surprising himself, the boy didn't thank him effusively or show submission. He just took the pastry with a disconcerting naturalness and sat on a nearby bench, slowly savoring each piece. Richard tried to return to his documents, but his eyes kept drifting to the boy. There was something familiar about him, something that provoked an unusual unease. He found himself observing the boy's controlled gestures, his upright posture, the way his eyes carefully observed the people around him. "Do you come here often?" asked Richard, again surprised by his own initiative. "Sometimes. Depends on the crowd and who's working," replied the boy, with an articulation that didn't match his appearance. "The people here usually don't mind my presence, as long as I don't." "Bother the customers. Do you live nearby?" The boy hesitated, evaluating the man in the impeccable suit. "More or less, I get by." The conversation was interrupted by the ring of Richard's cell phone. It was his assistant reminding him of the board meeting in half an hour. Richard stood up, left a generous tip on the table, and in an impulse he couldn't explain, looked at the boy. "I'll be back here tomorrow, around this time." It wasn't a question, nor exactly an invitation. It was almost a confirmation to himself. At the board meeting, Richard was physically present, but his mind kept returning to that brief encounter. While discussing mergers and acquisitions with his peers, he wondered about the boy's story. Why was he, who had spent his life shielding himself against any vulnerability, so intrigued by a simple street kid? The next day, Richard reorganized his schedule to ensure he would be back at that plaza at the same time. He ordered the same coffee with the same dessert and waited. For a moment, he thought the boy wouldn't show up, and a twinge of disappointment surprised him. But then he appeared, with the same simple clothes, the same attentive look. This time, he approached with more confidence. "You really came back," the boy stated. "I said I would," responded Richard, indicating the chair across from him. "Sit if you'd like." The boy settled in, looking with interest at the pastry on the table. "It's for you," said Richard, pushing the plate toward him. "Thank you," replied the boy, and after a pause added, "My name is Jason." "Richard Mitchell," he introduced himself, extending his hand formally as he did in business meetings. The boy returned the gesture with surprising firmness. His small, calloused hands contrasted with the businessman's well-manicured ones. "Mitchell." "Of Mitchell Investments?" asked Jason with a familiarity that left Richard intrigued. "Yes, how do you know that?" "I read newspapers, I find. You bought that struggling mining company last year and tripled the stock value in 6 months. It was a risky move, but brilliant." Richard couldn't hide his surprise. That specific knowledge wasn't common even among adults outside the financial world, much less among street children. "You're interested in the financial market?" "I'm interested in everything that can change lives," replied Jason with disconcerting maturity. "Money is power, and power well used can make a difference." The conversation flowed with a naturalness that Richard rarely experienced, even with his peers. Jason demonstrated not only knowledge, but an intuitive understanding of economics and business that seemed impossible for someone of his age and condition. As the boy spoke, Richard observed his gestures, his expressions, the way he articulated ideas. There was something strangely familiar, like a distant echo of something he couldn't fully identify. The meetings became frequent. 3 times a week, Richard adjusted his schedule to be at that cafe. At first, he told himself it was just curiosity, maybe even material for some social project that would improve the company's image. But gradually, he realized that these moments had become important to him. At home, Margaret noticed the subtle change in her husband's behavior. He seemed more distracted, less focused on the nightly reports he used to obsessively examine. "Any problems with business?" she asked during dinner, more out of protocol than genuine interest. "No, everything's under control," he replied, and surprisingly added, "I met an interesting kid. Has a surprising view of the world." Margaret raised her eyebrows, more intrigued by her husband's sudden willingness to share something personal than by the content of the revelation itself. "A talented intern?" "No, actually, he lives on the streets." The silence that followed was different from their habitual silences. It was loaded with unformulated questions. In the following weeks, Richard began bringing books for Jason, works on economics, administration, and market history. The boy devoured everything with impressive avidity, and at the next meeting discussed the concepts with authority. "Where did you study before?" asked Richard one day, realizing that the boy's prior knowledge went far beyond self-teaching. Jason hesitated, his gaze momentarily losing its usual firmness. "I studied at good schools before." "Before what?" "Before everything changed," he answered vaguely, looking away. "I don't really like talking about that." Richard respected the boy's silence, but his curiosity and concern grew. He began to wonder about Jason's family, about how such an intelligent and articulate boy had ended up on the streets. He realized that for the first time in many years, he was genuinely interested in someone else's story. At one of their meetings, Jason didn't show up. Richard waited for almost 2 hours, feeling an unease he couldn't name. The next day, he returned earlier and stayed until nightfall in vain. On the third day, when he was already considering looking for shelters and authorities, he spotted the boy approaching. Jason looked thinner and tired. A subtle bruise marked his left temple. "What happened?" asked Richard, unable to hide his concern. "Nothing important, just a disagreement." But there was something different in the boy's tone of voice, a vulnerability that Richard hadn't witnessed before. In that moment, he felt a protective impulse that surprised him with its intensity. "Jason, I want to help you, really." The boy stared at him with a mixture of distrust and hope. "Why?" It was a simple question, but it hit Richard like a blow. Why? Really? What did this boy mean to him? Why, after years of building walls around himself, did he feel so compelled to lower his defenses? "Because you're special," he finally answered, realizing the insufficiency of the words to express the whirlwind of feelings he was beginning to recognize in himself. That night, upon returning home, Richard couldn't resume his usual routine. He stood on the penthouse balcony, observing the illuminated city, thinking about how someone so small and apparently insignificant in the grand scheme of things had managed to shake the structures of his carefully controlled existence. What he didn't yet know was that this was just the beginning of a journey that would irrevocably transform his life, and that the bond beginning to form with Jason had much deeper roots than he could imagine. The heavy rain falling over New York didn't prevent Richard from keeping his meeting with Jason. Sheltered under the awning of the cafe, now closed due to the bad weather, the two observed the reduced movement in the plaza. The businessman had brought a small package, which he handed to the boy without further explanation. "What's this?" asked Jason, suspicious. "Open it and find out." Inside the package was a new smartphone with a prepaid card. Jason looked at the device and then at Richard with an expression difficult to decipher. "So we can stay in touch," explained the businessman. "I worry when you disappear." The boy didn't thank him immediately, as if he were evaluating the implications of that. "Gift, are you trying to buy me?" he finally asked with disconcerting frankness. Richard felt the impact of those words. In his world, expensive gifts often came accompanied by implicit expectations. But Jason's question made him realize that the boy's distrust was justified. In the world of the streets, nothing was free. "I'm not trying to buy you, Jason. I'm trying to ensure your safety. I want to know that you're all right, even when we don't see each other." The boy nodded slowly, still cautious, but accepted the gift. His fingers slid over the screen with a familiarity that confirmed this wasn't his first contact with technology. "Where did you sleep these rainy nights?" asked Richard, observing the boy's damp clothes. Jason shrugged. "I know some safe places." "Safe places on the streets during a storm?" "It's relative," replied the boy with a tired half-smile. "I've learned to adapt." That response provoked, in Richard, a sensation of impotence unusual for someone accustomed to solving complex problems with a simple phone call or bank transfer. He realized that despite his good intentions, he knew very little about Jason's reality. And before? Where did you live before? Adapting. The boy was silent for a few moments, his gaze lost in the raindrops running down the awning. "In a beautiful house with a garden." "In Greenwich," he finally answered. "With my mother." "And what happened?" Jason sighed as if the weight of that memory was physical. "We didn't understand each other anymore. She had expectations I couldn't meet. Too many rules, too many demands. And then," his voice failed and he looked away. "Then? I discovered some truths about my father, about my family, secrets she kept for years. It was like everything I believed was a lie." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. There was genuine pain in those words, a pain that he, even in his emotionally contained existence, could recognize. "Did you try to talk to her?" Jason laughed, a dry laugh without humor. "Talking wasn't exactly our family's strong point. My mother was always complicated. After we fought, she said I was just like my uncle, stubborn and arrogant. That was the last straw." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Something in that casual mention of an uncle awakened a deep unease. "Your uncle?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "A brother of hers I never met. Seems they fought many years ago and never spoke again. When she was really angry with me, she'd say I had the same look as him. Calculating was the word she used." Richard's heart accelerated. A suspicion began to form in his mind, so disturbing that he initially tried to push it away. "Jason, what's your mother's full name?" The boy stared at him, intrigued by the sudden intensity of the question. "Rebecca. Rebecca Mitchell Cooper." The world seemed to stop for an instant. Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. Rebecca Mitchell, his sister, with whom he hadn't spoken for more than 15 years after a devastating fight that had torn apart family ties. "What is it?" asked Jason, noticing the businessman's sudden paleness. "Do you know her?" Richard felt the weight of a revelation that would change everything. This boy wasn't just a street kid who had awakened his compassion. He was his nephew, his only sister's son, the boy whose existence he didn't even know about. "Jason, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice betraying the emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "My full name is Richard Mitchell. Rebecca is my sister." It was Jason's turn to pale. His eyes, so similar to Richard's, widened in shock and then narrowed in distrust. "That's impossible," murmured the boy. "You're lying." "I'm not. Rebecca and I grew up together in upstate New York. Our parents had an accident when we were young, and I took over the family business. I looked after her until..." "Until what?" challenged Jason with sudden anger. "Until we disagreed about the direction of her life. She wanted to pursue an artistic path, study literature. I insisted that she should study business, continue the family legacy. The fight was ugly. Words were said, things that can't be taken back." Jason rose abruptly, knocking over the chair. "So it's you? The rich, arrogant uncle who abandoned my mother when she needed you most, the one who never answered the letters or took the calls." "Letters? Calls?" Richard seemed genuinely confused. "I never received anything." "Lies. She showed me the returned letters, told me about the refused calls. You left her alone when you discovered she was pregnant. That's why she had to hastily marry a man she didn't love, who abandoned us when I was 5. The revelations fell like blows. Richard tried to process everything, connect the dots of a story that seemed distorted by resentments and misunderstandings. "Jason, I swear I didn't know about you. If I had known Rebecca was pregnant, I would never have kept my distance. Something is wrong with this story." But the boy was no longer listening. With tears in his eyes, he quickly moved away, losing himself among the pedestrians who were beginning to circulate again as the rain eased. Richard remained paralyzed, torn between the desire to run after his nephew and the understanding that this wasn't the moment. The revelation had been too traumatic for both. That night, the businessman couldn't sleep. He rummaged through old boxes stored in his penthouse office, looking for photos, letters, any connection to the past that might help him understand what had happened. Margaret observed him from a distance, intrigued by her husband's sudden obsession with memories he had always made a point of burying. "What's happening, Richard?" she finally asked. For the first time in years, he felt the need to share something real with his wife. "I discovered I have a nephew, Rebecca's son." Margaret knew the story of his sister only superficially. She knew there had been a rupture, but had never questioned the details, respecting her husband's silence on the subject. "How? Did you discover this?" "He's the street boy I mentioned, Jason. He's my nephew, Margaret, and he's living on the streets because he ran away from home after fighting with Rebecca." The coincidence seemed too absurd to be true, but Margaret knew her husband well enough to know he wouldn't invent something like this. "What are you going to do?" It was a simple question, but one that carried the weight of decades of emotional distance, calculated choices, and lost opportunities. "I'm going to find him again, and I'm going to look for Rebecca." The next day, Richard cancelled all his appointments, something unprecedented in his career. He drove to the Greenwich address he had obtained through his contacts. The house, although in an upscale neighborhood, showed clear signs of neglected maintenance. The garden, which Jason had mentioned, was poorly kept with high grass and dying plants. Taking a deep breath, he rang the doorbell. Seconds that seemed like hours passed until the door opened. And there she was, Rebecca, his younger sister, now a woman of 40, with the same penetrating eyes that had been passed on to Jason, but surrounded by lines of worry and fatigue. The recognition was immediate, followed by an expression of shock that quickly transformed into fury. "What are you doing here?" she asked, with a coldness that rivaled her brother's on his worst days of hostile negotiations. "I found Jason," he replied simply. Rebecca's face lost its color. Her hands gripped the door tightly, as if seeking support. "Where? Is he okay?" "Why didn't you bring him?" "He's living on the streets, Becca, and he just discovered I'm his uncle, not in the best way." The woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to absorb the impact of those words. When she reopened them, there were contained tears. "Come in," she finally said, making room at the door. "We have a lot to talk about." The living room reflected the exterior of the house, signs of a comfortable past mixed with evidence of recent difficulties. Photos of Jason at different ages adorned the walls, telling the story of an apparently happy childhood. "How long has he been missing?" asked Richard, observing a recent photo of his nephew smiling with a math trophy. 3 months, replied Rebecca, sitting heavily on a worn sofa. "We had a terrible fight. He found old letters I never sent to you." "Letters you never sent, but he told me you showed him returned letters." Rebecca looked away, the guilt evident on her face. "I lied to him. For years I fed his resentment against you, telling a distorted version of the story. I said you abandoned us, that you rejected all my attempts at reconciliation." "Why, Becca? Why lie about this?" "Because it was easier than admitting the truth. Easier than saying it was me who cut ties, that it was me who rejected your attempts at contact in the first years. Pride. Damn Mitchell pride." She laughed bitterly. "The same pride that made Jason slam the door and leave without looking back." Richard sat next to his sister, feeling the weight of the lost years, the unspoken words, the family ties weakened by misguided choices. "What really happened, Becca? After our fight," she sighed deeply, "I discovered I was pregnant a few weeks later. The father was an architecture student, a casual relationship with no future. I panicked. I thought about reaching out to you, but my pride wouldn't allow it. Then I met David, who offered to marry me and assume responsibility for the child. The man who abandoned you when Jason was 5. Rebecca nodded. "He never really managed to connect with Jason, and I never managed to truly love him. The marriage slowly died until he finally left. He left us in a complicated financial situation, but we managed to move forward." "Why didn't you contact me then?" "How could I? After years of feeding the narrative that you were the villain of the story. Besides, you already had your perfect life, your successful company, your convenient marriage. What would I be besides an inconvenient problem from the past?" The bitterness in her words hit Richard like a punch. Is that how his sister saw him? As someone cold and calculating, incapable of true empathy or connection? And Jason, what is he like? As a person? Rebecca's face softened for the first time. "Brilliant, stubborn, passionate about knowledge, has a mind for numbers I've only seen in you, but he also has a heart that cares deeply, even when he tries to hide it." Richard recognized the description. It was exactly the boy he had come to know over the last few weeks, a boy who, despite adverse circumstances, maintained an impressive dignity and intelligence. "We need to find him, Becca, together." She stared at him, distrust still present in her eyes. "Why, Richard? Why now, after all these years, do you suddenly care? What does Jason represent to you?" It was a fair question that demanded an honest answer. "Because he reminded me of who I was before I lost myself in the world I built. Because in the last few weeks, talking with a boy I didn't even know was my nephew, I felt more alive than in the last 15 years. And because despite everything, we're family." Rebecca studied her brother for a long moment, as if trying to see beyond the facade of the successful businessman, looking for traces of the young man who had once cared for her after their parents' loss. He won't trust you easily now, she warned. Not me either. Jason feels betrayed by both of us. Then we'll have to earn that trust back, replied Richard, with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. Day by day for as long as it takes. That same night, Richard sent a message to the cell phone he had given Jason. I talked to your mother today. She misses you. I do too. There are many things we need to clarify, stories that need to be told correctly. I'm not asking you to come home or to trust me immediately. I just ask that you meet me tomorrow at the usual place, to listen. Just that. The response took hours to arrive and contained only 2 words, I'll be there. For Richard, those 2 words carried more hope than any $1,000,000 contract had ever provided. It was the beginning of something that, for the first time, in a long time, couldn't be measured in numbers or projections, only in human possibilities, with all the risks and rewards that implied. The reunion in the plaza was tense. Jason arrived punctually, but kept a calculated distance, his body emanating distrust. Richard had arrived half an hour early, more nervous than he had ever been for any business meeting. Thank you for coming, said the businessman, indicating the chair across from him. Jason sat reluctantly, his eyes studying his uncle with a new perspective. You really didn't know about me, he asked directly, without preamble. No, Jason. If I had known I had a nephew, I would have moved mountains to find you. The boy considered the response, his gaze evaluating every micro-expression on his uncle's face. My mother lied to me for years. It wasn't a question, but a painful statement. Richard breathed deeply, searching for the right words. She was hurt, confused. Sometimes people construct narratives that help them deal with pain. How can you defend her? Questioned Jason, indignant. She distorted the whole story, made me believe you were a monster. I'm not defending what she did, just trying to understand. Families are complicated, Jason. We all make mistakes. What kind of mistake justifies lying to your own son for? 12 years? The question hung in the air, loaded with hurt. Richard realized there was no simple or comforting answer. None, he finally admitted. Nothing justifies it. But your mother is suffering from your absence. She wants to make peace, to fix things. Jason looked away, fixing his gaze on a distant point in the plaza. I don't know if I can go back to that house, pretend nothing happened. Nobody's asking for that. What happened was real and painful. It can't be erased or ignored. But maybe it can be the beginning of something new, something more honest. The boy looked back at his uncle, a vulnerability rarely seen in his gaze. Why do you care so much? Until a few weeks ago, you didn't even know I existed. It was a fair question that demanded an equally honest answer. Because when I met you, even before I knew who you were, I felt a connection I couldn't explain. Because somehow you reminded me of the man I wanted to be, before I lost myself in the corporate world's machinery. And because your family, Jason, my blood. The silence that followed was filled by the noise of the city around them, indifferent to the drama unfolding at that small table. I won't go back home now, Jason finally declared. I need time. I understand, but at least let me help you find a safe place to stay. I can't bear the thought of you sleeping on the streets. Jason considered the offer, weighing his wounded pride against the pragmatism of the situation. I have a proposal, said Richard, interpreting his nephew's hesitation. I own a small apartment downtown, occasionally used to host clients from abroad. It's empty now. You could stay there, have your own space without pressures or demands, just a safe place while you decide your next steps. The offer was tempting. After months on the streets facing constant dangers and cold nights, the prospect of a safe roof was almost irresistible. You would have to see your mother eventually, added Richard cautiously. Not to immediately return home, but to start a dialogue. She deserves at least that. Jason breathed deeply, his young face marked by a maturity forced by circumstances. I accept, but with one condition. I want the truth, all of it, about you, too, about the past, about why you disappeared from her life. You'll have it, promised Richard. No more secrets or half-truths. That same afternoon, Richard took Jason to the downtown apartment. It was a compact but comfortable space, with 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a small balcony with a view of the city. For the boy accustomed to the precariousness of the streets in recent months, it seemed like a palace. "I'll provide new clothes and supplies," said Richard, handing him the keys. "The refrigerator is stocked and there's a computer in the office you can use." Jason accepted the keys with a mixture of gratitude and distrust, still not entirely comfortable with the new situation. "Thank you," he murmured, almost inaudibly. "My number is on speed dial on the phone. Call for anything, anytime." When Richard left, Jason walked slowly through the apartment, exploring each room, testing the solidity of the walls, as if fearing everything might disappear at any moment. Finally, he allowed himself the luxury of a hot shower, the first in weeks, and let the tears he had held back for so long flow freely, protected by the noise of the running water. The next day, Richard called Rebecca. He agreed to stay in the apartment, he informed her. "But he's not ready to come home yet. Is he okay? Is he eating properly?" The maternal concern was evident in her voice. "Yes, he seems to be. Physically, at least. Emotionally. It will take time, Becca." "Can I see him?" Richard hesitated. "I gave my word that there would be no pressure, but I mentioned that eventually you would need to talk. Let's give him a few days to get used to the new situation." The silence on the other end of the line carried the weight of maternal anxiety, mixed with guilt. "I'm afraid, Richard," Rebecca finally confessed. "What if he never forgives me?" "He will, Becca. He's your son. But we have to give him space and time." In the following weeks, a cautious routine began to establish itself. Richard visited Jason almost daily, usually in the late afternoon. He brought books, games, or they simply talked about business, politics, philosophy, any subject that didn't directly touch the still open wounds. Jason, in turn, began to show signs of adaptation. He took care of the apartment meticulously, organized the books carefully, and even started a small herb garden project on the balcony. Gradually, the distrust in his eyes gave way to a cautious curiosity about his uncle and his world. During one of these visits, Richard brought an album of old photographs. "I thought you might like to know a bit more about your family," he explained, placing the album on the coffee table. Jason approached with hesitation, as if the photographs might burn him. Together, they leafed through images of a past the boy didn't know. Richard and Rebecca as children, playing in their grandparents' backyard. The parents he never knew. His mother as a teenager, with the same determined look he had inherited. "You seemed close," he commented, observing a photo where Richard, about 20 years old, carried Rebecca on his back, both laughing carelessly. "We were. After our parents passed away, I became a kind of guardian to her. I tried to protect her from everything, including herself sometimes." "What happened? Why did you fight so badly?" Richard sighed, feeling the weight of that old wound. "I wanted her to follow the safe path, study business, take on part of the family business. She wanted freedom to follow her own path, study literature, live different experiences. We were both too stubborn to yield. The final fight was brutal. Words were said that couldn't be taken back." Jason absorbed each word, connecting the dots of the family history. "Did you regret it?" "Every day since then, but pride, it's a terrible thing, Jason. It prevents us from taking the first step, from admitting we're wrong. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes." The boy nodded, recognizing something familiar in that dynamic. "Mom is the same, stubborn to the end." "It's a family trait, I'm afraid," smiled Richard melancholically. "You have your share too." Jason couldn't help a small smile of recognition. They continued to explore the album, filling gaps, building bridges over the abysses of the past. 2 days later, Richard received an unexpected call from Jason. "I want to see my mother," said the boy without preamble. "Tomorrow, if possible." The businessman felt a wave of relief course through his body. "Of course, I can arrange that. Do you want it to be at the apartment, or do you prefer a neutral place?" "The apartment is good. It's my territory now." The declaration carried a symbolism that didn't go unnoticed by Richard. Jason was claiming space, establishing boundaries, rebuilding his identity after months adrift. The next day, Richard picked up Rebecca at home. She was visibly nervous, alternating between fixing her hair and smoothing non-existent wrinkles in her clothes. "What if he hates me?" she asked as they entered the elevator of the building. "He doesn't hate you, Becca. He's hurt, confused. But he doesn't hate you." When the apartment door opened, revealing Jason, time seemed to freeze. Mother and son stared at each other in silence, years of love, conflict, and secrets hovering between them. "Hi, Mom," Jason finally said, his voice betraying contained emotion. Rebecca took a hesitant step forward, clearly struggling against the impulse to embrace her son. "Jason, are you okay? Are you eating properly?" The maternal concern, so simple and genuine, broke part of the tension. The boy nodded, inviting them in with a gesture. The meeting was initially uncomfortable, punctuated by silences and superficial conversations. But as the hours passed, something began to change. The invisible barrier between them began to show small cracks. "Why did you lie to me about Uncle Richard?" Jason finally asked, addressing the elephant in the room. Rebecca paled but maintained her son's gaze. "Because I was angry. Because it was easier to have a villain in the story than to admit my part in the rupture. And with time, the lie took on a life of its own. Each time you asked about family, about why it was just the two of us, I added more details, made the story more convincing, even to myself. Do you have any idea how I felt when I discovered the truth? When I found those unsent letters in your closet?" "Devastated," she answered, the tears finally escaping. "It was as if the entire world I had built for us collapsed. And then you left without looking back, and I thought I had lost you forever." Jason looked away, fighting against his own tears. "I needed space. I needed to discover who I was outside that house, outside those lies." "And did you discover?" Richard gently asked. The boy considered the question for a moment. "I discovered I'm stronger than I thought, and also more fragile. I discovered that life on the streets is much harder than any movie shows, and I discovered that—" He hesitated, looking at his mother. "That despite everything, I missed you. Every day." Those words were like a dam breaking. Rebecca sobbed openly, and Jason, after a moment of resistance, allowed himself to be embraced by her. Richard observed the scene with a lump in his throat, feeling simultaneously part of that moment and a privileged observer of something precious and fragile being reborn. When they finally separated, both mother and son seemed exhausted and relieved, like survivors of a long storm. "I'm not ready to go back home yet," declared Jason, discreetly drying his eyes. "I need this space this time." "I understand," replied Rebecca, visibly disappointed but respecting the decision. "Can I at least visit you? Regularly?" "I would like that," admitted the boy. Before leaving, Rebecca hugged her brother for a long time. "Thank you," she whispered, in his ear, "for bringing him back." "He was never really lost," replied Richard, "just finding his way." In the following weeks, a new dynamic began to form. Jason received regular visits from his mother and uncle, sometimes together, sometimes separately. Gradually, honest conversations replaced awkward silences, difficult truths were shared, and old wounds began the slow process of healing. During one of these visits, Richard brought an unexpected proposal. "I spoke with the principal of St. Paul's School," he said, referring to one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the city. "They're willing to accept you as a student next semester with a full scholarship." Jason's eyes widened in surprise. "Scholarship? I thought you would simply pay." Richard smiled, recognizing his nephew's insight. "I could, of course, but I thought you would prefer to earn it on your own merit. The scholarship would be based on your results in an aptitude test, no favoritism." The boy considered the proposal, clearly attracted by the idea of proving his worth. "What do you think?" he asked Rebecca, who was observing the interaction with interest. "I think it would be an incredible opportunity, but the decision is yours, son." Jason nodded slowly. "I'll take the test." 2 weeks later, the result arrived. Jason had not only passed, but obtained one of the highest scores ever recorded by the school. The news was celebrated by the three together with a special dinner in the apartment that was now increasingly becoming a home. During the meal, Richard observed the interaction between mother and son, the way Rebecca smiled proudly at each insightful comment from Jason, how the boy unconsciously imitated some of his mother's gestures. There were still evident fragilities, moments of tension, but there was also something new blossoming, an honesty that hadn't existed before. "I have another piece of news," announced Richard after dessert. "I bought the penthouse in the neighboring building. It's larger than this apartment, has 3 spacious bedrooms, and an incredible view of the city." Jason and Rebecca exchanged confused looks. "Is it an investment?" asked the boy. "In a way," replied Richard enigmatically. "I thought perhaps you two might consider living there, together." The silence that followed was loaded with emotion. "Not to replace your house in Greenwich," he hastened to explain, "but as a new beginning, a place without painful memories, without ghosts from the past." Rebecca seemed stunned by the proposal. "Richard, it's very generous, but we can't accept something like that. It's not charity, Becca. It's family, and I'm not giving it. I'm investing in you, in us." Jason studied his uncle with an intensity reminiscent of their first meeting in the plaza. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why do all this for us?" Richard breathed deeply, searching for the right words. "Because you taught me something, Jason, something I had forgotten a long time ago. That true value isn't in the contracts we sign or the bank accounts we accumulate. It's in the connections we build, the bridges we erect over the abysses that separate us." The boy nodded slowly, understanding the depth of those words. "And because," continued Richard, "maybe it's time for all of us to have a new beginning." That night marked a decisive turning point. Not a magical resolution of all problems, nor an erasure of past pains, but the conscious recognition that new paths were possible. Paths built not on illusions or unrealistic expectations, but on the honest acceptance of who they were, individually and as a family. As he said goodbye, Richard noticed something different in Jason's eyes. Not just the sharp intelligence or cautious distrust that had initially attracted him, but something deeper: hope. The same hope that he realized now was beginning to reflower in his own heart after years of emotional hibernation. 6 months had passed since Jason accepted moving to the new penthouse with his mother. The transition hadn't been easy. There were days of tense silence, heated discussions, and moments of retreat to old patterns. But gradually, something new began to take shape. A relationship based not on idealizations or expectations, but on acceptance and truth. Richard observed this transformation with a mixture of pride and fascination. He visited them frequently, sometimes just for a quick coffee, other times for long dinners that extended into the early morning hours in deep conversations. During one of these nights, after Jason had retired to study, Rebecca served 2 glasses of wine and led her brother to the balcony. "Have you noticed he's smiling more?" she commented, looking toward her son's room, where a light still shone. "I have," replied Richard. "At school, too. The principal told me he's integrating well, despite entering mid-year." Rebecca observed her brother with curiosity. "You've been following closely, haven't you?" "I try not to interfere too much, but yes, I follow. It's important to me." "To all of us," she smiled, lightly touching her brother's arm. "Who would have thought, after so many years?" Richard contemplated the illuminated city below them. "Sometimes I think about how all this began, a casual encounter in a plaza, a boy asking for leftover food." "Fate has a peculiar sense of humor," reflected Rebecca. "It took my son running away from home and you meeting him by chance for us to reconcile." It wasn't just reconciliation, Becca. It was transformation. And it was true. In recent months, Richard had experienced changes that surprised everyone around him. The first and most shocking was the announcement of his separation from Margaret, a surprisingly amicable process, as if both silently recognized that their marriage had never really been a meeting of souls, just a convenient social contract. "Margaret called today," Rebecca commented casually. "She wants to meet Jason before moving to London." "That's good. Despite everything, she was part of my life for a long time." "Do you miss her?" Richard considered the question honestly. "Not in the way I should miss a wife. I miss the company, the routine, but there was no real connection there. And now, what comes next?" "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a meticulously elaborated 5-year plan, and that's liberating." Richard's transformation wasn't limited to his personal life. At the company, employees and partners noticed significant changes in his approach. The relentless, calculating executive now demonstrated unexpected empathy, a willingness to listen to different perspectives, a genuine concern for the human impact of his decisions. "The partners are restless," he confided to Rebecca. "They think I'm getting soft, that I'll compromise results with social concerns." "And will you?" "No. I'll improve them, just not in the traditional way." Indeed, Richard had initiated a silent reformulation of the corporate culture. He began by introducing real benefits for employees with children, a scholarship program for young people from underprivileged communities, and revisions to investment policies to incorporate sustainability and social impact criteria. The experience with Jason made me realize how much talent we're losing through pure prejudice and lack of opportunities, he had explained in a tense board meeting. The changes met resistance, of course. There were rumors of an attempt to remove him from the presidency, led by more conservative partners. But Richard remained firm, sustained by a conviction he had never felt in years of purely strategic decisions. Jason observed these transformations with growing interest. The nephew became a frequent visitor to his uncle's office, absorbing knowledge about the corporate world, but also questioning practices and suggesting alternatives with the irreverence typical of youth. One particularly tense afternoon after a difficult meeting, Richard found Jason waiting in his office. "Bad day?" asked the boy, noticing the tiredness on his uncle's face. "Challenging," corrected Richard, loosening his tie. "I'm trying to explain to 60-year-old men that social responsibility isn't charity, but long-term strategy. And they don't understand. They need time. They've spent decades believing that the only indicator of success is quarterly profit." Jason nodded, spinning distractedly in the chair. "Uncle, remember that day in the plaza when we met?" "Of course, why?" "I was thinking, what if we created a place like that? A cafe or restaurant where homeless people could not only receive food, but learn, work, rebuild their lives." Richard observed his nephew with admiration. Even after everything he had been through, Jason's heart remained open. His mind focused on possibilities for transformation. "Go on," he encouraged. "It could be a pilot project of the Mitchell Foundation, a dignified space, not a charity soup kitchen, a place where talents could be discovered and developed." "Mitchell Foundation," Jason smiled, a little embarrassed. "I've been thinking about this for a few weeks. The company invests in specific social projects, right? But what if it had a permanent foundation, focused on identifying and developing talents in vulnerable situations?" The idea immediately captured Richard's imagination. It wasn't just a social project. It was a reconnection with purpose, a way to honor the journey that had united them. "Let's develop this," he decided, "together." The following week, Richard surprised everyone by announcing the launch of the Mitchell Foundation, with an initial focus on education and opportunities for young people in vulnerable situations. Even more surprising was the appointment of Rebecca as executive director. "My sister has experience in cultural management and a sensitivity that perfectly complements my strategic vision," he explained to the journalists present. What he didn't publicly mention was that the idea had come from Jason, or that the pilot project would be exactly what his nephew had imagined: a school cafe in the center of the city, offering not just dignified meals, but also training and work opportunities. "The New Beginnings Cafe," suggested Jason when they discussed the name. "Because everyone deserves a second chance." The cafe's inauguration 6 months later was a discreet but significant event. Without the usual pomp of corporate launches, it gathered only people directly involved in the project. Among them was Michael, one of the first beneficiaries, a middle-aged man who had lived on the streets for years after losing everything in a troubled divorce, and who would now be the chef responsible for the kitchen. "I never thought anyone would believe in me again," he confessed, emotional during his brief speech. Richard, observing the scene alongside Jason and Rebecca, felt a satisfaction that no business deal had ever provided. It was as if a fundamental piece had finally found its place in his existence, completing a puzzle he didn't even know he was putting together. The success of the New Beginnings Cafe exceeded all expectations. In less than a year, it became not only self-sustainable, but a model replicated in other regions of the city. Each unit had its own identity and team, but they shared the same philosophy: dignity, opportunity, and recognition. Jason, now almost 14, divided his time between increasingly advanced studies. He had skipped a school year due to his exceptional performance and involvement in the Foundation's projects. Without abandoning his interest in the financial world, he had found a way to connect it to broader purposes. "I'm thinking of studying behavioral economics," he commented during a family dinner. "There's something fascinating about how economic decisions are influenced by psychological and social factors." "Harvard has an excellent program in that area," Richard observed casually. Rebecca gave him a warning look. "He's only 14, Richard. Let him finish high school first." "I'm just planning ahead," the businessman defended himself with a complicit smile for his nephew. The truth was that the relationship between uncle and nephew had deepened in ways neither could have predicted. It wasn't just the intellectual affinity or shared interest in business, it was a deeper connection, as if each filled a gap in the other's life. For Jason, Richard represented a male model that combined strength and sensitivity, ambition and purpose. For Richard, his nephew was simultaneously a reminder of the idealistic young man he had been and a bridge to the more complete man he wished to become. Richard's transformation didn't go unnoticed in the business circle. Articles began to be written about his conversion from financial shark to humanist leader, some complimentary, others skeptical. Invitations for speeches and participation in forums about impact businesses multiplied. "They're creating a myth," he commented to Rebecca after reading another exaggeratedly complimentary profile, "as if I'd gone through some mystical epiphany." "And didn't you?" she teased. "It was more complicated than that, and it continues to be. I have days when I'm still the old Richard, focused only on numbers, impatient with emotional distractions. The difference is that now you recognize that and try to balance." Balance indeed had become the great challenge. Between the demands of the company, the growth of the foundation, and the strengthening of family ties, Richard often felt divided. There were moments of relapse into old patterns, days when he isolated himself in work, neglecting important personal commitments. On one such occasion, he missed Jason's presentation at a science fair, something he had promised to attend. His nephew's project, a sophisticated analysis on investor behavior in uncertainty scenarios, won first place, but Richard's absence left a bitter taste in the celebration. "I'm sorry," he apologized later, visibly embarrassed. The meeting with foreign investors extended beyond what was expected. Jason nodded, accepting the explanation, but Richard noticed the disappointment in his eyes. "It's no excuse," he added. "I should have left the meeting, regardless of the consequences. Some things are more important than business." "It's okay," replied Jason, but his tone said otherwise. That night became a turning point for Richard. He realized that despite all the changes, he still struggled against deeply rooted patterns. The difference now was his willingness to recognize failures and work to correct them. The next morning, he surprised everyone by announcing he would take 2 weeks of vacation, something unprecedented in his career. Even more surprising was the invitation he extended to Jason and Rebecca. "I thought we could go to the Adirondacks," he proposed. "No cell phones, no emails, just the three of us reconnecting with what really matters." The trip was transformative, in more than one sense. Away from the pressures of the city, professional commitments and social expectations, the three found space to heal old wounds and build new memories. Walks on challenging trails, swims in crystal-clear lakes, conversations around the campfire, simple moments that, paradoxically, seemed richer than any corporate luxury. "You know what I realized in these days?" commented Richard as they watched the sunset from atop a mountain. "That I spent decades building a life that didn't allow me to really live." "It's never too late to change course," replied Rebecca, resting her head on her brother's shoulder in a gesture that echoed their shared childhood. "It's strange," reflected Jason, seated near them. "If I hadn't run away from home, if we hadn't met in that plaza, none of this would be happening. The universe has mysterious ways of putting us on the right path," philosophized Richard, "even when we think we're completely lost." Upon returning to New York, something fundamental had changed in the family dynamic. Trust, previously fragile and full of reservations, now established itself on more solid foundations. The wounds, although not completely healed, no longer bled at the slightest touch. The following months brought new challenges and achievements. The Mitchell Foundation expanded beyond the initial project, embracing initiatives in education, culture, and professional training. Rebecca proved to be a remarkable manager, combining social sensitivity with administrative rigor. Richard, in turn, initiated a deeper restructuring in the company, preparing it for a future where purpose and profit walked side by side. The process wasn't without pain. Some executives chose to leave. Traditional investors questioned the new direction. But for every challenge, an unexpected opportunity also emerged. New talents attracted by the renewed vision, partnerships with organizations aligned with similar values, recognition for pioneering practices. Jason followed everything with growing interest, absorbing lessons that no school could offer. His science fair project evolved into a broader study on behavioral economics applied to social investments, attracting the attention of university professors and researchers in the field. "He has the potential to revolutionize the way we understand social impact," commented a Harvard professor, who visited the foundation to learn about the work being developed. Amid so many transformations, there were also moments of doubt and retreat. The resistance in the corporate world sometimes seemed insurmountable. The slowness of social changes frequently frustrated expectations. Occasional family conflicts reminded them that reconciliation was a continuous process, not a final destination. On a particularly difficult night, after an attempt to sabotage the Foundation's scholarship program, Richard found himself again in that same plaza where everything had begun. He sat at the cafe table, now under new management, and ordered an espresso. "Thinking about life?" asked a familiar voice. Jason was there, as if he had guessed where to find him. "How did you know I would be here?" The boy smiled. "Intuition. Or maybe because I come here sometimes. Too, when I need to think." They sat in silence for a few minutes, observing the movement in the plaza, so similar and yet so different from that fateful day more than a year ago. "You know what I think sometimes?" commented Jason. "That on that day, it wasn't just you who offered me leftover food. It was as if the universe was offering us a leftover of hope, one last chance for reconnection." Richard observed his nephew with admiration. Amid all the changes, perhaps the most significant was this: Jason's ability to find meaning and purpose even in the most painful experiences. "And we seized that chance," he responded. "With both hands," completed the boy, extending his in a symbolic gesture that Richard returned without hesitation. In that moment, under the darkening New York sky, surrounded by the urban bustle that had once seemed so alien to them, uncle and nephew shared more than a handshake. They shared the silent certainty that some connections, once established, transcend circumstances, time, and even the human flaws that inevitably test them. The journey was far from over. There would still be obstacles to overcome, relationships to strengthen, projects to develop. But something fundamental had been achieved: the courage to look beyond appearances, to break destructive cycles, to believe in the possibility of new beginnings, even when everything seems irreparably lost. And it all began with an apparently simple gesture: a boy asking for leftovers, a man offering more than food, offering presence, attention, the chance for a genuine encounter that would end up transforming not just two lives, but an ever-widening circle of existences touched by the cascading effect of that improbable reconnection. "Shall we go home?" Richard finally suggested. "Your mother is probably waiting." "Let's go," agreed Jason, standing up. "After all, that's what family is, isn't it? The place we can always return to, no matter how far we've strayed." And as they walked side by side, their silhouettes gradually blending into the urban landscape, there was a silent certainty between them. The true home wasn't a physical address, but this sacred space of mutual acceptance, patiently built on the ruins of old hurts, illuminated by the daily willingness to choose connection instead of isolation, understanding instead of judgment, love instead of indifference. A space that, once found, no one would ever wish to abandon. Dear listeners, we hope that the journey of Richard, Jason, and Rebecca has touched your hearts. To continue exploring equally moving stories about human connections and new beginnings, we've prepared a special playlist that you can find by clicking on the link to the left of the screen. If this narrative awakens something in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the transformative power of meaningful encounters. Share in the comments which moment of this story touched you the